There's a promise millions of people organize their entire lives around. A guarantee that if you endure this life correctly, accept suffering patiently, follow religious rules, submit to authority, you'll receive infinite reward after death, heaven, paradise, eternal bliss. The promise seems generous, even loving. God asking you to endure temporary hardship for permanent joy. But here's the unsettling question. What if this promise was designed not to reward you later, but to control you? Now, what if heaven doctrine exists primarily to make you accept conditions you should be changing? Watch what happens to people who take heaven seriously. They don't fight injustice because justice will come in afterlife. They don't pursue fulfillment because fulfillment awaits in heaven. They don't demand fair treatment because their reward isn't in this world. They accept poverty, exploitation, abuse, oppression, not because these are good, but because enduring them patiently supposedly earns heavenly treasure. The promise of future compensation makes present suffering seem bearable, even meaningful. But what if you're sacrificing your one certain life for uncertain promise? What if heaven exists primarily as a psychological mechanism to prevent people from improving earthly conditions? This creates strange inversion, where the worse your life gets, the more spiritual you're considered. Suffering becomes badge of faith rather than problem requiring solution. The person accepting abuse as their cross is praised for Christ-like patience. The person demanding better treatment is criticized for lacking faith in God's plan. The person living fully now is worldly and materialistic. The person postponing life until heaven is spiritually mature. Its perfect control system make people see their exploitation as spiritual opportunity, their suffering as heavenly investment, their acceptance of injustice as godliness. They police themselves, choosing continued suffering over resistance, because resistance risks heavenly reward. One philosopher recognized this pattern as Christianity's most effective tool for preventing social change. He watched as religious people accepted terrible conditions, not because conditions were good, but because heaven would compensate later. He saw how afterlife doctrine made people passive in face of injustice, how promise of future reward prevented demands for present justice, how waiting for heaven meant not living on earth. What he discovered wasn't just theology. It was psychological mechanism that makes oppressed people complicit in their oppression by making oppression seem like investment in eternal portfolio. The question isn't whether heaven exists. The question is whether believing in heaven helps you live better now or prevents you from living at all. Because here's what happens when you postpone living until afterlife. You never actually live. You spend your entire existence waiting, enduring, accepting, preparing for life that supposedly starts after death. Meanwhile, the only life you're guaranteed, this one, passes unused. You were so focused on destination that you forgot journey is the only part you definitely experience. The promise of heaven might be stealing your life while promising to give you better one later. Can you afford not to examine whether waiting for eternity is costing you the present moment? Here's what doesn't make sense about heaven. As central Christian focus, Jesus barely mentioned it. His teaching emphasized kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven, but context suggests he meant transformed earthly existence, not afterlife destination. When he taught disciples to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," he was asking for heaven's reality to manifest on earth, not for people to escape earth for heaven. His Beatitudes bless the poor, the mourning, the persecuted, not by promising them heaven later, but by declaring them blessed now. His ministry focused on healing present suffering, feeding present hunger, liberating present oppression. The future dimension was secondary to present transformation. Then something shifted as Christianity developed. Paul's letters introduced stronger afterlife emphasis, partly to comfort believers facing persecution and death. But the balance was still toward present transformation, dying and rising with Christ now, participating in new creation now, experiencing Spirit's presence now. By medieval Christianity, though, heaven had become primary focus. Life on earth was just waiting room for real life after death. Earthly existence was test determining eternal destination. Present suffering was investment in future reward. The shift was dramatic. From Jesus' focus on transforming earth into heaven's image to Christianity's focus on enduring earth to reach heaven. The timing reveals the pattern. Heaven emphasis intensified as Christianity gained institutional power. When church became wealthy and politically connected, while most believers remained poor and powerless, heaven doctrine explained the contradiction. Church leaders lived in luxury while teaching. Poverty was spiritual virtue because treasure is in heaven. Kings and nobles exploited peasants while priests taught that accepting exploitation patiently earned heavenly reward. The worse earthly inequality became, the more Christianity emphasized afterlife compensation. It's revealing that heaven got emphasized most when earthly conditions were worst and when those teaching about heaven benefited from believers not demanding earthly improvements. Consider also what behaviors heaven doctrine encourages versus discourages. Accepting suffering is heavenly virtue. Resisting suffering risks heavenly reward. Submitting to authority pleases God. Challenging authority is prideful rebellion. Giving to church increases heavenly treasure. Keeping resources for yourself is worldly materialism. Focusing on spiritual matters is godly. Focusing on improving material conditions is missing what matters. The pattern shows heaven doctrine consistently supports behaviors that maintain existing power structures, acceptance, submission, religious giving, spiritual focus, while discouraging behaviors that might change those structures, resistance, autonomy, resource retention, material improvement. The psychology is revealing. When reward is deferred to unknowable future, you can't verify whether you're actually receiving it. Church can promise heaven while never having to deliver. You can sacrifice your entire earthly life for heavenly reward that might not exist, and you'll only discover the truth after you're dead. It's perfect, unfalsifiable promise. Meanwhile, those teaching you about heaven receive concrete benefits now. Your donations, your obedience, your acceptance of conditions that serve their interests. They get paid in this life to promise you payment in next life. The asymmetry is striking. You sacrifice now for maybe reward later. They benefit now from your sacrifice now. Nietzsche identified this as one of Christianity's most sophisticated psychological operations. Take people's natural desire for better life and redirect it away from improving present conditions toward waiting for future paradise. The desire remains, but becomes politically neutered. Instead of demanding justice now, people wait patiently for justice after death. Instead of creating heaven on earth, they accept hell on earth while dreaming of heaven after earth. The doctrine doesn't eliminate desire for better existence. It just postpones that desire indefinitely, making it safe for systems that benefit from people not pursuing better existence now. What does it mean that heaven gets emphasized most by those who benefit from you, not demanding earth be more heavenly? Friedrich Nietzsche grew up surrounded by heaven doctrine, and watching its effects shaped his entire philosophical project. His Lutheran upbringing in mid-19th century Germany emphasized afterlife as life's true purpose. Earthly existence was preparation for eternity. Present suffering was temporary and meaningful, as test of faith. Real life started after death, for those who endured correctly. He watched his mother and sister accept difficult conditions, not because conditions were acceptable, but because heaven would compensate. He saw congregants in his father's church endure poverty while giving to church, accepting their lot as God's will while waiting for heavenly reward. The contradiction troubled him deeply. These were good people, sincere believers, living lives of quiet desperation while focusing on paradise they'd never seen. They postponed joy, suppressed desires, accepted injustice, all for promise that couldn't be verified until after death when verification was impossible. Meanwhile, church leaders who taught them about heaven lived quite comfortably in present. The bishops and theologians emphasizing heavenly treasure weren't exactly suffering earthly deprivation. They had nice homes, good food, social status. The heaven they preached seemed primarily useful for keeping others content with less. The turning point came when Nietzsche studied ancient Greek culture and philosophy. The Greeks didn't organize life around afterlife reward. They focused on excellence now, on living fully now, on creating meaning in present existence. They built philosophy, art, democracy, science, all focused on improving earthly life rather than enduring it for heavenly compensation. And they seemed more vital, more creative, more fully alive than Christians obsessed with afterlife. This suggested heaven doctrine might actually diminish life rather than enhance it, that focusing on afterlife paradoxically made people less alive in the one life they definitely had. He began investigating systematically in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Antichrist. He was examining how Christianity's afterlife focus functioned psychologically and socially, what it enabled and what it prevented, who benefited from believers deferring fulfillment until after death. What he found disturbed him. Heaven wasn't primarily theological doctrine about cosmic reality. It was social control mechanism that prevented people from demanding better earthly conditions by promising better conditions later. It made believers passive, accepting, willing to endure rather than change. It was opiate, numbing pain of present by creating dream of future. What made Nietzsche's analysis so cutting was that he'd lived this psychology personally. He knew from inside what it felt like to organize life around afterlife, to see present as preparation rather than as life itself, to accept conditions that seemed wrong because heaven would make it right. He understood the appeal. Life is often hard, and afterlife compensation seems fair, but he also recognized the cost. You sacrifice your one certain existence for uncertain promise. You never fully live because you're always preparing for real life that supposedly comes later. You accept conditions you should resist because resistance risks heavenly reward. The promise of heaven was stealing people's lives while claiming to offer better life. The personal stakes were enormous. If Christianity was right and he was wrong, he was risking eternal salvation by questioning heaven doctrine. The afterlife itself was designed to prevent this questioning. Doubt about heaven might cost you heaven. But Nietzsche couldn't ignore what he observed. Belief in heaven made people less alive, less resistant to injustice, less insistent on present fulfillment. It made them willing accomplices in their own diminishment. And the people teaching them about heaven, church authorities, wealthy Christians, those benefiting from status quo, weren't exactly suffering. They emphasized heaven for others, while enjoying earth themselves. The pattern suggested heaven doctrine served power by making powerless people content with powerlessness through promise of future compensation that conveniently never had to be delivered in present. Nietzsche's first concrete evidence came from examining who emphasizes heaven most versus who lives most fully in present. The pattern was striking and consistent. Those with power, wealth, comfort, they acknowledged heaven but didn't organize lives around it. They pursued earthly goods, earthly pleasures, earthly achievement. They lived as if this life mattered tremendously. Meanwhile, they taught the powerless, the poor, the suffering that earthly life was temporary trial and real life came after death. The message was effectively, you should focus on heaven, we'll handle earth. The asymmetry revealed heaven doctrine's function. Those benefiting from earthly arrangements taught those suffering from those arrangements to wait for heavenly compensation rather than demanding earthly justice. This appeared clearly in how Christianity handled economic inequality. Jesus taught that it's easier for camel to pass through needle's eye than for rich person to enter heaven. Early Christians shared possessions communally, but as Christianity institutionalized, heaven doctrine became explanation for accepting inequality rather than challenge to eliminate it. Poor people were taught their poverty was spiritual blessing because they'd inherit heaven, while rich people struggled with materialistic attachments. This made poverty seem like advantage rather than injustice. Meanwhile, wealthy Christians maintained their wealth, apparently comfortable risking that camel through needle's eye difficulty. The rich taught the poor that wealth didn't matter because heaven mattered more, but the rich kept their wealth anyway. Actions revealed what people actually believed versus what they taught others to believe. The evidence became clearer when Nietzsche examined what heaven doctrine encouraged people to accept. Slavery was defended using heaven. Enslaved people should accept bondage patiently because their reward would come in heaven, while slaveholders who enjoyed earthly power risked eternal punishment. Except slaveholders didn't seem very worried about that risk. They kept slaves while assuring slaves that heavenly compensation made earthly slavery bearable. When workers demanded better conditions, they were told to focus on heavenly treasure rather than earthly wages. When women sought equality, they were reminded that earthly hierarchy didn't matter because everyone was equal in heaven. The pattern was consistent. Heaven doctrine was deployed to prevent oppressed people from demanding justice now by promising justice later. Nietzsche found explicit theological development of this function. Medieval Christianity taught that suffering patiently was Christ-like virtue, that accepting earthly injustice demonstrated faith in God's plan, that demanding immediate justice showed lack of trust in divine wisdom. Thomas Aquinas wrote that earthly inequality was part of God's order and would be corrected in afterlife for those who accepted it faithfully. Luther told rebelling peasants to accept their suffering because their treasure was in heaven. The theology consistently valued patient endurance over active resistance, always emphasizing that real compensation came after death, so present conditions shouldn't be resisted too vigorously. What emerged from this evidence was recognition that heaven doctrine functioned as social pacifier. Like mother telling crying child, "You'll get candy later if you're good now." Heaven promised future reward for present submission. And like that child who never receives candy because later never comes, believers sacrificed present for future that never arrived in verifiable form. The difference is, candy can eventually be verified. Heaven can't be verified until you're dead, when you're no longer in position to demand the compensation you were promised. It's a perfect system for extracting lifetime of sacrifice in exchange for unverifiable promise. And crucially, those who teach this doctrine don't have to live by it themselves. They can pursue earthly goods while teaching others to wait for heavenly ones. The pattern reveals that heaven doctrine serves those who benefit from others, not demanding better earthly conditions. It's not about cosmic reality. It's about social control disguised as spiritual truth. Nietzsche pushed deeper and found specific mechanisms through which heaven doctrine prevents present living. The primary mechanism is temporal displacement, making present moment seem less important than future moment. When real life starts after death, present moment is just preparation. You're not fully living now. You're getting ready to live later. This creates psychological state where you're never actually present, never fully engaged with current experience, because current experience is just prelude to real experience coming after death. You can't be fully present when you're fundamentally oriented toward absent future. You're always waiting, never arriving, because arrival supposedly comes post-death. This temporal displacement extends to how people approach suffering and joy. Suffering is investment in future heavenly reward, so accept it patiently rather than changing conditions causing it. Joy is potential distraction from heavenly focus, so suppress it or feel guilty about it rather than fully experiencing it. The result is people who neither fight their suffering nor embrace their joy. They endure suffering while waiting for heaven and suspect joy as potentially worldly temptation. They're not fully alive in their pain or their pleasure because both are just temporary states before real existence begins. Life becomes holding pattern rather than life itself. Nietzsche documented how this affects relationships and experiences. If earth is just temporary and heaven is eternal, earthly relationships matter less than heavenly reunion. So people don't fully invest in present relationships because real connection comes later. They don't fully grieve losses because heaven will restore what's lost. They don't fully celebrate moments because heaven will provide superior moments eternally. This creates strange emotional distance from life. You're living it, but you're not in it, because you're always oriented elsewhere. The philosopher who praised living fully in present, the Greeks, particularly Epicureans, were dismissed as hedonistic worldly materialists by Christians who were essentially refusing to fully live the one life they definitely had. The mechanism operates particularly powerfully through making present world seem corrupt and worthless. Early Christianity taught that world was fallen, corrupted by sin, under Satan's control. Real home was heaven. Christians were just sojourners passing through hostile territory. This isn't theology encouraging careful stewardship of creation. It's theology encouraging contempt for earthly existence. If world is irredeemably fallen and your real home is elsewhere, why work to improve world? Why create art celebrating earthly beauty? Why develop science understanding earthly reality? Why build just societies when this whole earth will be destroyed and replaced with heaven? The theology actively discouraged investment in improving earthly conditions because earth was temporary, corrupt, disposable. Nietzsche found evidence of this in how Christian cultures approached life, compared to pre-Christian or non-Christian cultures. Ancient Greeks created democracy, philosophy, tragic art exploring human condition, scientific inquiry into nature, all based on assumption that earthly existence mattered tremendously. Medieval Christianity produced theology about heaven, art depicting saints and afterlife, philosophy focused on preparing soul for eternity, based on assumption that earthly existence was just test for real life after. Renaissance and Enlightenment only flourished when Western culture moved away from heaven-focused Christianity toward recovering Greek emphasis on earthly life's value. The pattern suggested heaven doctrine actively suppressed human flourishing by making present existence seem less important than speculative future. What emerged was recognition that heaven isn't just false promise, it's theft. It steals your attention from present to absent future. It steals your energy from improving earth to dreaming of heaven. It steals your life from living to waiting. And this theft serves those who benefit from you not fully living, not demanding justice, not insisting that earth should be more heavenly. They can exploit your labor, enjoy their earthly pleasures, maintain their earthly power while teaching you that earth doesn't matter and heaven compensates everything. They live fully now while teaching you to live fully later, and later never comes in verifiable form. You die still waiting, having sacrificed your one certain existence for uncertain promise that benefited others more than you. How many people died having never fully lived because they were saving their living for after death? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered becomes undeniable when you examine which problems heaven doctrine is used to address versus which problems demand immediate solution. Systemic injustice, heaven will fix it, so endure patiently. Economic exploitation, your treasure is in heaven, so earthly. Poverty doesn't matter. Abuse and oppression, accept your cross like Jesus. Heaven rewards suffering. Every problem requiring systemic change or resistance to power gets deferred to afterlife. Meanwhile, problems that don't threaten power structures demand immediate attention. Sexual sin must be addressed now. Doctrinal error must be corrected now. Church authority must be submitted to now. The pattern reveals that heaven is invoked specifically to prevent changes that would threaten existing power, while problems that don't threaten power require urgent present action. This appears clearly in how different Christian movements deployed heaven doctrine. Wealthy churches emphasized heaven most strongly when teaching poor congregants. Slaveholder Christianity emphasized heaven when teaching enslaved people. Colonial Christianity emphasized heaven when teaching indigenous populations whose land was being stolen. The message was consistent. Your present suffering is temporary and will be compensated eternally, so don't resist the conditions creating your suffering. Meanwhile, the same churches taught those benefiting from existing structures to be good stewards of their earthly resources, to use their wealth wisely, to exercise their power responsibly, all earthly-focused teaching emphasizing present rather than dismissing it as unimportant compared to heaven. Consider also how heaven doctrine handles questions of justice. If heaven will ultimately right all wrongs, earthly justice becomes less urgent. Victims of injustice are taught to leave vengeance to God, who will repay in afterlife. This is presented as spiritually mature, trusting divine justice rather than demanding human justice. But functionally, it prevents accountability. Abusers face no earthly consequences because victims are taught to focus on heavenly justice. Exploiters keep their gains because the exploited are told compensation comes later. Oppressors maintain power because the oppressed are promised future liberation. Heaven becomes theological justification for allowing injustice to continue because justice will supposedly arrive post-death. The revealing test is examining whether heaven-focused Christians actually live as if earth doesn't matter. They don't. They pursue earthly goods, protect earthly interests, demand earthly justice when they're wronged. The heaven emphasis appears primarily when teaching others to accept conditions those teaching wouldn't accept themselves. Wealthy Christians teach poor Christians that earthly wealth doesn't matter while keeping their own wealth. Powerful Christians teach powerless Christians that earthly power doesn't matter while maintaining their own power. Safe Christians teach endangered Christians that earthly life doesn't matter while protecting their own lives. The asymmetry reveals that heaven is taught primarily to others as reason for their acceptance, not lived by teachers as guide to their own choices. Nietzsche identified the psychological mechanism making this work. Heaven creates moral hazard, where present actions seem less consequential because real accounting comes later. If heaven will compensate for earthly suffering, tolerating injustice seems acceptable. If heaven will punish evildoers, pursuing earthly justice seems unnecessary. If heaven is eternal and earth temporary, present moment seems relatively worthless. This makes people passive in face of injustice, tolerant of exploitation, willing to sacrifice present for future. And this passivity serves anyone benefiting from unjust present conditions. They don't need to use force when they can use heaven doctrine to make people accept conditions force would be required to maintain. Promise future compensation, and people tolerate present exploitation. Promise eternal justice, and people don't demand immediate justice. Promise heavenly life, and people sacrifice earthly life. It's more efficient than tyranny because people submit voluntarily while thinking they're making wise spiritual investment. The pattern shows heaven isn't just theological belief about afterlife. It's social mechanism that protects unjust earthly arrangements by redirecting demands for justice away from earth toward unprovable afterlife. The implications of organizing life around heaven extend into profound psychological and existential damage. When you defer living until afterlife, you never actually live. You spend your entire existence in waiting room, never entering the life you're waiting for because it supposedly starts after you die. This creates fundamental alienation from present moment, from present experience, from present relationships. You're never fully here because here isn't where life really happens. You're always elsewhere mentally, oriented toward absent future, unable to be present because present isn't where you've been taught to focus. The result is people who go through motions of living without actually being alive, because their attention is permanently displaced toward somewhere they've never experienced and can't verify exists. This manifests in how heaven-focused people approach experiences. Every experience is filtered through lens of, does this help or hinder my path to heaven? Rather than, is this experience worth having for its own sake? Pleasure becomes suspect because it might distract from heavenly focus. Pain becomes meaningful because it supposedly earns heavenly reward. But neither pleasure nor pain is fully experienced. Both are just evaluated for their impact on afterlife prospects. You can't fully enjoy anything when you're worried it might cost you eternity. You can't fully learn from pain when you're told it's investment in future compensation. You're not engaging with life. You're constantly calculating how present experience affects theoretical future that may not exist. The damage extends to how people approach relationships. If earth is temporary and heaven eternal, earthly relationships are provisional. Real relationship comes later in heaven. This prevents full intimacy, full commitment, full presence with others because you're always holding back, always remembering this is temporary, always orienting toward eternal reunion that makes present connection less important. Parents don't fully engage with children because they'll have eternity together later. Partners don't fully invest in marriage because earthly marriage ends at death, while heavenly relationship continues. Friends maintain emotional distance because earth is just temporary stopover. The doctrine that seems to promise eternal relationship actually prevents present relationship by making present seem less real than future. Nietzsche recognized this as Christianity's deepest existential crime, teaching people to reject the one life they definitely have for speculative life they might not have. You get one guaranteed existence, this one now, on earth. Everything else is theory. Heaven might exist or might not. Afterlife might be real or might not. But this life, this moment, this experience, this is definitely real. And heaven doctrine teaches you to treat what's definitely real as less important than what's possibly real. To sacrifice certain present for uncertain future. To live your entire existence as if it's not real existence, just preparation for real existence coming later. This is profound alienation from reality itself, from the one thing you can be certain of, that you exist now, here, in this moment. The social cost appears in how heaven-focused cultures approach earthly problems. If earth is fallen, temporary, disposable, why work hard to fix it? Environmental destruction becomes acceptable because earth will be destroyed and replaced anyway. Social injustice becomes tolerable because heaven will correct it. Suffering becomes meaningful because it's temporary hardship earning eternal reward. The theology produces passive acceptance of conditions that should be actively resisted because those conditions are framed as temporary features of fallen world rather than as injustices demanding correction. This serves anyone benefiting from environmental destruction, social injustice, or others' suffering. They can pursue earthly goods while teaching victims that earthly conditions don't matter because real life comes later. Its perfect system for maintaining exploitation. Make the exploited believe their exploitation is temporary inconvenience on path to eternal compensation, and they'll tolerate exploitation rather than demanding its end. The promise of heaven prevents the creation of more heavenly earth because it makes earthly conditions seem less important than they are. Here's where Nietzsche's investigation becomes genuinely disturbing. Heaven doctrine wasn't organic theological development that accidentally served social control functions. It was strategic adaptation by Christianity as it gained institutional power, specifically designed to make believers accept earthly conditions that served church and state interests. The evidence appears in how heaven emphasis intensified exactly when Christianity needed populations to accept, rather than resist, their circumstances. Early Christianity, when it was persecuted, minority actually emphasized present transformation, kingdom of God breaking into present reality, Spirit's power available now, new creation beginning now. The focus was on God intervening in present to change present conditions. But once Christianity became Roman state religion under Constantine, heaven emphasis intensified. Suddenly the teaching shifted toward patience, endurance, waiting for heavenly reward rather than expecting present transformation. This wasn't coincidental. When Christianity was powerless, it taught about God's power transforming present. When Christianity gained power and needed to maintain stable populations, it taught about deferring to afterlife, what couldn't be provided now. Church fathers wrote explicitly about heaven's utility for social stability. Augustine taught that earthly inequality was part of God's order, that the poor should accept poverty patiently while awaiting heavenly compensation, that trying to create earthly equality was presumptuous rejection of divine plan. This wasn't just theology. It was policy recommendation to ruling class about how to maintain control. Teach people their suffering is meaningful preparation for heaven, and they won't demand immediate relief from suffering. Teach people real life starts after death, and they'll tolerate conditions in present life that should be intolerable. The heaven doctrine emerging in this period served obvious political function, making populations manageable. Medieval church intensified this pattern. While accumulating enormous wealth and political power, it taught that earthly wealth didn't matter, and poverty was spiritual virtue. While building cathedrals and living luxuriously, bishops taught peasants to focus on heavenly treasure rather than earthly conditions. The contradiction was blatant. Those teaching most strongly about heaven's importance weren't living as if earthly existence was unimportant. They pursued earthly power, earthly wealth, earthly pleasure, while teaching others that such pursuits didn't matter because real reward came in heaven. The theology they taught others contradicted how they lived themselves. Protestant Reformation didn't eliminate this pattern. Luther told rebelling peasants to accept suffering because their treasure was in heaven. Calvin taught predestination that made earthly status seem like reflection of eternal destiny, convenient for those with earthly status. Both emphasized heaven as compensation for earthly hardship while maintaining comfortable earthly circumstances themselves. Evangelical Christianity continues the pattern. Prosperity gospel preachers live in mansions while teaching congregants that earthly wealth doesn't matter compared to heavenly treasure. Megachurch pastors accumulate earthly power while teaching submission to authority because real authority is in heaven. The truly disturbing element is how explicitly Christian leaders understood heaven doctrine's control function. Letters between bishops, theological treatises, church councils, the documents reveal conscious awareness that heaven teaching was useful for maintaining social order. When rulers asked how to keep populations content despite poverty and oppression, church recommended emphasizing heavenly reward. When revolutions threatened established order, church intensified heaven preaching. When workers demanded better conditions, church reminded them their real employer was in heaven. This wasn't unconscious pattern. It was deliberate strategy deployed by people who understood that promises of future compensation prevent demands for present justice. Nietzsche identified this as Christianity's most cynical operation, those enjoying earthly life teaching others that earthly life doesn't matter, those with earthly power teaching others that earthly power is temporary, those living fully now teaching others to live fully later. And the later never comes in verifiable form. So the teaching can continue indefinitely without anyone able to prove they weren't compensated as promised. It's perfect scam. Extract lifetime of submission in exchange for payment that's only deliverable after death when verification is impossible, and present it as spiritual wisdom rather than exploitation. The question isn't whether every pastor understands this consciously. It's whether the pattern persists because it serves institutional interests regardless of individual intentions. The question emerges: if Nietzsche exposed how heaven doctrine prevents present living and serves social control, why isn't this widely understood? Why do millions still organize lives around afterlife despite evidence that this serves others more than themselves? The answer reveals how effectively the doctrine protects itself from examination through multiple reinforcing mechanisms. The primary defense is that questioning heaven is itself framed as risking heaven. If you doubt afterlife exists, that doubt might cost you eternal salvation. The programming includes protection against investigation. Examining whether heaven is real might damn you to hell if it is real. This creates paralysis where people can't honestly investigate because investigation itself is too dangerous. Pascal's wager gets deployed. Better to believe in heaven just in case. Because if you're wrong, you lose nothing, while if you're right, you gain everything. But this ignores that believing in heaven costs your present life, makes you tolerate conditions you shouldn't tolerate, prevents you from living fully now. You don't lose nothing if you're wrong. you lose your entire existence spent waiting for compensation that never comes. The second defense is that heaven provides psychological comfort, despite being psychologically damaging. When life is painful, imagining future compensation makes present suffering tolerable. When you lose loved ones, believing you'll reunite in heaven makes grief bearable. When existence feels meaningless, afterlife provides sense that present struggle serves larger purpose. Heaven is comforting lie, and most people prefer comforting lie to uncomfortable truth. The truth is, you're likely not getting compensated for present suffering. Your relationships end at death. Your existence might not have cosmic purpose. That's hard to accept. Heaven makes everything easier to bear by, promising everything will be fixed later. So people maintain belief not because evidence supports it, but because alternative is psychologically uncomfortable. The third defense is social consequences. In religious communities, questioning heaven marks you as spiritually compromised, possibly losing your faith, dangerous to others' faith. You face isolation, relationship loss, community rejection. For people whose entire social structure is church-based, the cost of honest doubt about heaven is losing everything. So most suppress their questions, maintain surface belief, never voice the obvious observation that organizing life around unverifiable future while sacrificing verifiable present seems like bad trade. This prevents collective examination that might destabilize the belief. Each doubter thinks they're alone, keeping quiet to maintain belonging. Modern resistance follows these patterns precisely. When you suggest heaven doctrine prevents present living and serves social control, believers respond that you're worldly, materialistic, missing spiritual dimension, risking eternal salvation. The emotional intensity reveals what's being defended. It's not just doctrine about afterlife. It's entire psychological structure that makes present suffering bearable by promising future compensation. Acknowledging heaven might not exist means acknowledging you're not getting compensated for present suffering, that your suffering might be pointless, that you've been tolerating conditions you should have changed. That's unbearable for people who've organized entire lives around heaven hope. The most effective suppression is that few people who teach heaven live as if they believe it. Religious leaders emphasize afterlife while very much caring about present life, their comfort, their health, their wealth, their power. They pursue earthly goods while teaching others earthly goods don't matter. But this contradiction doesn't discredit the teaching because followers assume leaders must know something justifying the apparent hypocrisy. Maybe earthly goods are necessary for ministry. Maybe leaders have special calling requiring earthly resources. Maybe the teaching applies differently to those in spiritual authority. The followers don't recognize the pattern. Those benefiting from present conditions teach others to wait for future conditions while not waiting themselves. The asymmetry reveals that heaven is taught primarily to make others accept conditions teachers wouldn't accept, to redirect demands for justice away from earth, where justice would cost teachers something, toward heaven, where justice costs teachers nothing. The system persists because it's self-sealing, psychologically comforting, socially enforced, and practiced differently by those teaching it than by those learning it. Heaven doctrine survives not because it's true, but because questioning it is made dangerous, because it provides comfort, because doubting it isolates you, and because those with most to gain from others believing it don't actually live by it themselves. The pattern suggests heaven serves institutional and social control functions more than it serves believers' actual well-being. But recognizing that requires facing uncomfortable possibility that you've been living for future that doesn't arrive, sacrificing present for promise that doesn't deliver. The final question isn't whether heaven exists metaphysically. The final question is whether organizing your life around heaven serves you or steals from you, and the evidence is overwhelming. Heaven doctrine makes you tolerate injustice now by promising justice later, makes you accept suffering now by promising compensation later, makes you sacrifice living now by promising life later. Whether heaven is real or not, the functional result of believing in it is that you don't fully live the one life you're guaranteed. You spend your existence waiting, enduring, preparing for life that supposedly starts after you die. Meanwhile, the only life you definitely have passes unused. What Nietzsche understood that most people still don't. Even if heaven exists, postponing life until you reach it is still sacrificing your present existence. You don't get this moment back, this conversation, this sunset, this relationship, this experience. Once it passes, it's gone. You can't retrieve it from heaven. You can only fully have it now by being fully present for it now. But heaven doctrine trains you to never be fully present, because present isn't where life really happens. You're always elsewhere mentally, oriented toward future, unable to be here because here isn't important enough. The result is people who reach death never having fully lived because they were saving their living for after death. The practical path forward requires examining what you're sacrificing for heaven. Are you staying in abusive relationship because divorce risks heavenly reward? That's heaven stealing your safety. Are you tolerating poverty because earthly wealth doesn't matter compared to heavenly treasure? That's heaven justifying your exploitation. Are you accepting injustice because God will right wrongs in afterlife? That's heaven preventing you from pursuing justice. Are you suppressing desires because indulging them might cost eternity? That's heaven alienating you from yourself. Are you enduring rather than changing conditions because suffering earns reward? That's heaven making you complicit in your own oppression. Start treating present moment as if it matters, because it does. This moment is definitely real. Heaven is speculation. This experience is guaranteed. Afterlife is theory. This life is certain. Future compensation is unverifiable. Stop sacrificing what you have for what you might have. Stop tolerating conditions now for compensation later. Stop waiting to live until after death. This doesn't mean abandoning spirituality or meaning. It means grounding spirituality and meaning in present rather than deferring them to absent future. Heaven can be born in present moment when you're fully present for it, when you experience beauty fully, when you love fully, when you pursue justice fully, when you live fully. Some people find that releasing heaven focus allows them to develop richer spirituality based on present transformation rather than future compensation. They discover that pursuing justice now, creating beauty now, loving fully now is more spiritually meaningful than waiting for heaven to provide those things later. Others find that without heaven, religious framework stops making sense entirely, that their faith depended on future reward, justifying present sacrifice. Still others develop entirely secular approach focused on making this life as good as possible, since it's the only life guaranteed. The destination, too, matters less than the honesty of examining whether heaven belief serves your present living or prevents it. Nietzsche's invitation wasn't to predetermined conclusion about whether afterlife exists. It was to examine whether organizing life around afterlife helps you live better now, or prevents you from living at all. Whether those teaching you about heaven live by what they teach or pursue earthly goods while telling you earthly goods don't matter. Whether waiting for future compensation is worth sacrificing present existence. If you can't question heaven without experiencing that questioning as spiritual danger, that reveals how thoroughly the programming was installed. If examining costs and benefits of heaven belief feels like betraying God, that shows how the doctrine protects itself from investigation. Real faith can withstand examination. Only manufactured faith requires protection from honest questions. Real spirituality enhances present living. Only corrupted spirituality makes you sacrifice present for speculative future. Real spiritual teaching would encourage full engagement with this life as gift from God. Teaching that makes you treat this life as worthless compared to next life serves those who benefit from you not demanding this life be better. The asymmetry is revealing. Those with good earthly lives teach others that earthly life doesn't matter. They're not giving up their earthly goods. They're teaching you to give up yours. The architecture of heaven doctrine was designed to keep you waiting rather than living, accepting rather than demanding, enduring rather than changing. But you're not required to wait. This moment is here. This life